The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Mitchell walked through the familiar corridors one last time. Her combat boots echoed against the polished floors, each step a reminder of the 15 years she had dedicated to serving her country. Today was different. Today, she was leaving behind everything she had ever known. Sarah had been one of the most decorated soldiers in her unit. Her call sign Ghost had struck fear into enemy forces across 3 different conflict zones. She earned the nickname during her first deployment in Afghanistan, where her ability to move unseen through hostile territory and gather crucial intelligence had saved countless lives. Her superiors praised her tactical brilliance, her fellow soldiers respected her leadership, and her enemies learned to fear the whisper of her presence. But that was before the incident that changed everything. It happened during her final mission in Syria. Sarah's team was tasked with extracting a high-value target from a heavily fortified compound. The intelligence was solid, the plan was flawless, and Sarah had led similar operations dozens of times before. However, what they didn't know was that their communications had been compromised. The enemy was waiting. The ambush was swift and brutal. Sarah watched helplessly as 3 of her team members fell in the opening moments of the firefight. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, she managed to rally the surviving members and fight their way to the extraction point. But the damage was done. The mission failed, lives were lost, and Sarah carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The military investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. No fault was officially assigned to Sarah, but whispers began to spread throughout the base. Some questioned her decision-making during the ambush. Others wondered if the legendary Ghost had finally lost her edge. The media, hungry for a story, painted her as a soldier who had stayed too long in the field, whose reflexes had slowed with age. Sarah tried to push through the criticism and doubt. She threw herself into training, working harder than soldiers half her age. She volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, desperate to prove that she still had what it took. But the whispers followed her everywhere. In the mess hall, conversations would stop when she entered. During briefings, she could feel the skeptical glances of her colleagues. The breaking point came during a routine training exercise. Sarah was leading a squad through a simulated urban warfare scenario when one of the younger soldiers questioned her orders in front of the entire team. The soldier, barely 22 years old, had the audacity to suggest that maybe it was time for the old guard to step aside and let the new generation take over. Sarah maintained her composure during the exercise, but that night she stared at herself in the mirror of her quarters. The reflection showed a 40-year-old woman with premature gray streaks in her dark hair and scars that told stories of battles fought and won. But all she could see were the doubts that had been planted by others, growing like weeds in her mind. The final straw came when her commanding officer, Colonel Harris, called her into his office for what he called a career counseling session. Harris had been her mentor for years, the man who had recommended her for her first leadership position and supported her through every promotion. Now, he sat across from his desk with the uncomfortable expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "Sarah, you know I have nothing but respect for what you've accomplished," Harris began, his voice carefully measured. "But I'm concerned about the impact recent events are having on unit morale. Some of the newer recruits are starting to question the chain of command, and there's talk that maybe it's time for some changes." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had expected this conversation, but hearing it from Harris made it real. "Are you asking me to resign, sir?" Harris looked uncomfortable. "I'm not asking anything. I'm simply presenting you with options. You've served with distinction, and you could retire with full honors. Take some time, find a new purpose outside the military. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is knowing when to step back." That night, Sarah sat in her empty quarters surrounded by commendations, medals, and photographs from her years of service. She thought about the young woman who had enlisted straight out of high school, determined to make a difference in the world. That woman had believed that courage and dedication were enough to overcome any obstacle. Now, she wasn't sure what she believed anymore. The process of leaving the military was surprisingly quick. Within weeks, Sarah found herself signing discharge papers and turning in her equipment. Her fellow soldiers gave her a respectful farewell dinner, but she could sense the relief in the room. Everyone was ready to move on, including her. Sarah's transition to civilian life was jarring. After spending her entire adult life in a structured environment where every day had purpose and meaning, she found herself adrift in a world that seemed foreign and unwelcoming. She rented a small apartment in a quiet suburb and tried to figure out what came next. The job search was humbling. Despite her extensive military experience, potential employers seemed hesitant to hire a former soldier. Some cited concerns about her ability to adapt to corporate culture. Others worried about potential PTSD or other service-related issues. The few interviews she managed to secure ended with polite rejections and promises to keep her resume on file. Months passed, and Sarah found herself slipping into a routine of isolation and self-doubt. She would wake up each morning without purpose, spend hours watching news coverage of ongoing conflicts where she felt she should be serving, and go to bed questioning every decision that had led her to this point. The confident soldier who had once led men and women into battle was being replaced by someone she didn't recognize. The worst part was watching her former colleagues continue their careers while she struggled to find her place in the civilian world. Social media updates showed promotions, new assignments, and successful missions. Meanwhile, Sarah was trying to figure out whether her military experience qualified her to work in private security or corporate training. Her family tried to be supportive, but they didn't understand what she was going through. Her parents were proud of her service, but relieved that she was finally safe. Her sister encouraged her to enjoy retirement and suggested she take up hobbies like gardening or painting. They meant well, but their advice only reinforced how disconnected she felt from the world around her. Sarah began to wonder if the critics had been right. Maybe she had stayed too long in the military. Maybe her time had passed, and she was just too stubborn to admit it. The woman who had once been feared by enemies and respected by allies was now struggling to convince a retail manager that she was qualified for a part-time position. As winter approached, Sarah found herself spending more time alone in her apartment, avoiding contact with former military colleagues, and declining invitations to veterans events. She told herself she was taking time to figure out her next move, but deep down she knew she was hiding from a world that seemed to have no place for her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived firefights, navigated hostile territory, and made life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. But somehow, figuring out how to live as a regular citizen felt like the most challenging mission of her life. Every day felt like a reminder that the skills that had made her exceptional as a soldier were useless in the real world. Sarah's confidence, once unshakable, crumbled a little more each day. The woman who had been known as Ghost was becoming invisible in a different way, fading into the background of a society that had moved on without her. She began to believe that maybe her critics were right. Maybe she was washed up, a relic of conflicts that the world was eager to forget. But sometimes, the most profound transformations come from the deepest valleys. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her story was far from over. The skills that had made her a legend in the military were about to be tested in ways she never imagined. And soon, the world would remember exactly why enemies had feared the call sign Ghost. The foundation of doubt had been laid, the fall from grace complete. But, as any good soldier knows, the ability to adapt and overcome is what separates the truly exceptional from the merely adequate. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that her greatest battles lay not behind her, but ahead, waiting in the shadows of an uncertain future that would demand everything she had learned and more than she thought possible. 6 months into her civilian life, Sarah Mitchell had settled into a routine that barely resembled living. Her alarm clock had been replaced by the natural rhythm of sleeping until noon, driven by nights spent staring at the ceiling and questioning every decision that had brought her to this point. The small apartment she rented felt more like a prison than a home, its walls closing in a little more each day. Her savings were running dangerously low. The few job interviews she had managed to secure had led nowhere, each rejection adding another layer to the growing certainty that she was unemployable. The skills that had made her invaluable on the battlefield seemed to translate poorly to corporate boardrooms and retail environments. HR managers would smile politely while reviewing her resume, but she could see the doubt in their eyes when they tried to picture a former special operations soldier filing reports or managing inventory. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Sarah had always been a social person during her military career, comfortable leading teams and building camaraderie with fellow soldiers. Now, she found herself avoiding eye contact with neighbors and declining the few social invitations that came her way. The confident leader who had once commanded respect in the most dangerous places on earth couldn't figure out how to make small talk at a grocery store checkout. Her family's well-meaning but misguided attempts to help only made things worse. Her mother would call weekly with suggestions about volunteer opportunities at local charities, as if organizing food drives could somehow replace the adrenaline rush of tactical operations. Her father, a retired factory worker who had never understood his daughter's military ambitions, seemed relieved that she was finally safe, but couldn't comprehend why she wasn't happier about it. The financial pressure was mounting. Sarah had been living off her military savings and a modest pension, but the cost of rent, utilities, and basic living expenses was draining her resources faster than she had anticipated. She had applied for dozens of jobs, from security positions to administrative roles, but something always went wrong during the interview process. Either her qualifications were seen as too specialized, or potential employers worried about her ability to adapt to civilian workplace culture. The rejection that hurt the most came from a private security company that she thought would be perfect for her background. The interviewer, a former police officer who had never served in the military, spent most of their conversation asking condescending questions about her ability to handle real-world situations that didn't involve combat. He seemed to view her military experience as a liability rather than an asset, suggesting that soldiers often struggled to scale back their responses to appropriate levels for civilian security work. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah's daily routine had devolved into a cycle of job searching, rejection, and self-doubt. She would wake up in the late morning, spend a few hours half-heartedly browsing employment websites, and then retreat to her couch to watch news coverage of ongoing international conflicts. Seeing reports from regions where she had once served only reinforced her sense of displacement and irrelevance. The breaking point came on a particularly cold December morning when Sarah discovered that her bank account had dropped below the minimum balance required to avoid fees. For someone who had once managed multi-million-dollar military operations, the irony of being charged $25 because she couldn't maintain a basic checking account balance felt like the ultimate humiliation. She was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at the bank statement and trying to figure out how to stretch her remaining funds through the next month when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it seemed official. Sarah almost didn't answer, assuming it was another debt collector or automated marketing call, but curiosity got the better of her. Sarah Mitchell? The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that she remembered from her military days. Yes, this is Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, my name is Director James Crawford from the Department of Homeland Security. I'm calling because we have a situation where we believe your specific expertise might be valuable. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? Sarah's first instinct was to assume this was some kind of scam. In her current state of mind, the idea that anyone in the federal government would want her help seemed absurd. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I think you might have the wrong person. Former Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, call sign Ghost, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment and later Special Operations. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Syria, decorated for valor in combat operations. Is this correct? Sarah felt her heartbeat quicken for the first time in months. Someone not only knew who she was but seemed to respect her service record. Yes, that's correct. But I'm no longer active duty. We're aware of your current status, Ms. Mitchell. That's actually why we're calling. We have a situation that requires someone with your particular background and expertise, but it needs to be handled through civilian contractors rather than active military personnel. The political sensitivities involved make it impossible to use official military resources. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. After months of being told that her military experience was more of a hindrance than a help, someone was actually seeking her out because of it. What kind of situation are we talking about? I can't discuss details over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that it involves a hostage situation with international implications. The perpetrators have specifically requested someone with unconventional warfare experience, and your name came up during our discussions with military intelligence. Can you meet me at the Federal Building downtown in 2 hours? Sarah looked around her small apartment, taking in the unmade bed, the stack of unpaid bills on her counter, and the general air of defeat that had settled over her living space. 6 months ago, she would have been suspicious of such a vague request. But 6 months ago, she had been a different person with different options. I'll be there, she said. The drive to the Federal Building felt like waking up from a long sleep. Sarah found herself sitting up straighter behind the wheel, her mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had served her well during her military career. She began considering possibilities for what kind of situation would require her specific expertise, but couldn't be handled through official military channels. The Federal Building was exactly what she expected: imposing, sterile, and crawling with security personnel who looked like they had been military themselves at some point. Sarah presented her identification and was escorted through several layers of security checkpoints before being led to a conference room on the 8th floor. Director Crawford turned out to be a man in his early 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent time in the intelligence community. His handshake was firm, and his eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that Sarah recognized from her former commanding officers. With him was a woman introduced as Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in international terrorism and hostage negotiation. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Crawford began as they settled around the conference table. Before we go any further, I need you to understand that everything discussed in this room is classified at the highest levels. Are you prepared to sign appropriate confidentiality agreements? Sarah nodded, feeling a familiar surge of purpose that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Of course. Dr. Rodriguez opened a thick file and spread several photographs across the table. Sarah immediately recognized them as surveillance photos taken in what appeared to be an urban Middle Eastern environment. 12 hours ago, a group calling themselves the Liberation Front of the Righteous captured the American embassy staff in the small nation of Kazakhstan. 23 Americans are being held hostage, including the ambassador and several CIA operatives whose presence there was not publicly known. Crawford leaned forward. The political situation is extremely delicate. Kazakhstan is technically an ally, but their government is unstable, and there are questions about whether some elements within their military might be sympathetic to the hostage takers. We can't risk a full military response that could destabilize the entire region. Sarah studied the photographs, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical challenges they represented. What do the hostage takers want? That's where things get interesting, Dr. Rodriguez continued. They've made the usual demands about prisoner releases and political recognition, but they've also made one very specific request. They want to negotiate directly with a former American Special Operations soldier who has experience in unconventional warfare. They've specifically mentioned that they want someone who understands their perspective and won't simply try to overwhelm them with superior firepower. Crawford slid another document across the table. Based on intelligence analysis and your service record, our psychological profiling team believes you might be uniquely suited for this situation. Your experience in similar environments, combined with your tactical expertise and your current civilian status, makes you an ideal candidate to serve as our primary negotiator. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and terror. After months of being told that her military experience was irrelevant, she was being asked to use those very skills to save American lives. But she was also acutely aware of how much was at stake. What makes you think they'll trust me? And what makes you think I'm the right person for this job? Dr. Rodriguez smiled slightly. Because they've specifically requested someone with your call sign. Ghost. They know who you are, Ms. Mitchell, and they've asked for you by name. Sarah felt the room spin slightly. The implications were staggering. Not only did the hostage takers know about her military service, but they had specifically requested her involvement. This meant that her reputation had reached far beyond the American military community, extending into the very networks of people she had spent years fighting against. Crawford continued, "We've spent the last several hours trying to understand how they know about you and why they've made this request. Our intelligence suggests that you've developed something of a legend among certain groups in the region. Your methods, your tactical approach, and your success record have earned you a reputation that transcends traditional enemy lines. They respect you," Dr. Rodriguez added. which gives us a unique opportunity to establish genuine communication rather than simply making demands and threats. Sarah thought about the months she had spent doubting herself, wondering if her military career had really mattered or if she was just a washed-up soldier living in the past. Now, it seemed that her reputation had traveled further and carried more weight than she had ever imagined. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah asked. Crawford's expression became more serious. "We're asking you to travel to Kazakhstan as a civilian contractor and serve as our primary negotiator with the hostage takers. You would be working with a small team of specialists, but the ultimate success or failure of this mission would rest on your shoulders. You would have full authority to negotiate terms and make tactical decisions as the situation develops." Sarah looked at the photographs again, studying the faces of the American hostages and trying to imagine the fear they must be experiencing. She thought about the months of rejection and self-doubt, the growing certainty that she was no longer useful to anyone. Now, 23 American lives depended on whether she could find the courage to step back into the world she had left behind. "How much time do I have to decide?" she asked. "Our plane leaves for Kazakhstan in 4 hours, Crawford replied. "I know this is a lot to process, but we don't have the luxury of time. Every hour we delay increases the risk to the hostages." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to quiet the voice in her head that whispered about all the ways this mission could go wrong. But louder than that voice was another one, the voice of the soldier she had been before doubt and criticism had dimmed her confidence. That voice was telling her that this was exactly what she had been trained for, that all the years of preparation and experience had been leading to this moment. When she opened her eyes, Crawford and Dr. Rodriguez were watching her intently, waiting for her decision. Sarah thought about the young woman who had enlisted in the military with dreams of making a difference in the world. That woman would never have hesitated. "I'm in," she said. The flight to Kazakhstan gave Sarah 12 hours to study intelligence reports, tactical assessments, and psychological profiles of the hostage takers. As the plane crossed over the Atlantic, she felt the familiar sensation of her mind shifting into operational mode, the doubt and uncertainty of the past months gradually being replaced by focused determination. Her team consisted of 3 specialists: Marcus Webb, a communications expert with experience in international crisis management; Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist specializing in terrorist behavior; and Captain Rick Torres, an active-duty military liaison who would coordinate with local forces. All 3 had impressive credentials, but Sarah could sense their skepticism about working with a recently discharged soldier who had been out of action for months. The skepticism was understandable. Sarah herself wasn't entirely sure she was ready for this level of responsibility after so much time in civilian limbo. During the flight, she caught herself second-guessing tactical decisions she would have made automatically during her active service. The confident soldier who had earned the call sign Ghost seemed like a different person, someone she had been rather than someone she still was. Dr. Foster had compiled extensive background information on the hostage-takers' leader, a man known as Khalil Rahman. According to intelligence reports, Rahman was a former military officer who had turned against his own government after losing family members in a coalition airstrike. His group, the Liberation Front of the Righteous, had been responsible for several smaller attacks over the past 2 years, but the embassy seizure represented a dramatic escalation in their capabilities and ambitions. "What's interesting about Rahman," Dr. Foster explained as they reviewed his file, "is that he's not motivated purely by religious extremism or political ideology. Intelligence suggests he's seeking revenge for what he sees as personal wrongs committed by American forces. This makes him potentially more rational than other terrorist leaders, but also more unpredictable." Marcus Webb had established communication protocols with the Situation Room back in Washington and with local authorities in Kazakhstan. The political situation in the country was indeed delicate, with the government caught between their alliance with America and pressure from elements within their own military who sympathized with Rahman's anti-American message. As the plane began its descent into Kazakhstan's capital city, Sarah looked out the window at the landscape below. The country was mountainous and harsh, similar to regions where she had served during her military career. But seeing it now, as a civilian contractor rather than an active soldier, felt different. She was no longer protected by the full authority and resources of the American military. If things went wrong, she would be largely on her own. The American embassy compound was located in the diplomatic quarter of the capital, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire that had proved insufficient to prevent the attack. Local police and military forces had established a perimeter around the building, but their rules of engagement were strictly limited to containment rather than assault. Any aggressive action could spark a broader conflict that would destabilize the entire region. Sarah's first meeting with local authorities took place at a command post established in a building 2 blocks from the embassy. The Kazakhstan military commander, General Hakim Nazari, was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of allowing American civilians to take the lead in resolving the crisis. His English was heavily accented but precise, and his manner suggested years of military training and combat experience. "I must tell you honestly," General Nazari said as they reviewed tactical maps of the embassy compound, "my government is under tremendous pressure to resolve this situation quickly. There are elements within our military who believe we should assault the building and accept whatever casualties result. They see American hesitation as weakness." Captain Torres leaned forward, studying the layout of the embassy building. "What kind of defensive positions have the hostage-takers established? How many personnel are we dealing with?" "Intelligence suggests between 12 and 15 fighters," Nazari replied. "They have positioned snipers on the upper floors and have barricaded the main entrances. They appear to have significant ammunition supplies, and there are concerns that they may have explosive devices planted throughout the building." Sarah absorbed this information while studying photographs of the embassy compound. The building was a modern structure with multiple floors and a complex layout that would make any assault extremely dangerous for both the hostages and the attacking force. Traditional military tactics would likely result in significant casualties, which explained why her unconventional approach was being requested. "Have they communicated any specific demands or timeline?" Sarah asked. "They have established radio communication with our command post," General Nazari explained. "They have demanded the release of political prisoners, withdrawal of American military advisors from our country, and international recognition of their organization as a legitimate political movement. They have also specifically requested to speak with someone they call the American Ghost." Sarah felt a chill at hearing her old call sign spoken in this context. The fact that Rahman's group not only knew about her but had specifically requested her involvement suggested a level of intelligence gathering that was both impressive and disturbing. Dr. Foster had been analyzing communication transcripts from the hostage-takers' radio contacts. Their language patterns suggest they're well-educated and strategically sophisticated. This isn't a desperate group acting on emotion alone. They've planned this operation carefully and have specific objectives they're trying to achieve. Marcus Webb had established secure communication links with Washington and was monitoring international news coverage of the crisis. "The story is starting to break in American media," he reported. "So far the focus is on the hostage situation itself, but if this drags on much longer, there's going to be significant pressure for military action." Sarah realized that time was working against them in multiple ways. The longer the crisis continued, the more likely it became that either the Kazakhstan government would lose patience and authorize an assault, or political pressure in Washington would force a military solution. Either scenario would likely result in significant casualties among the American hostages. "I need to establish direct communication with Rahman as soon as possible," Sarah decided. "If they specifically requested to speak with me, then that's our best chance of opening meaningful negotiations." General Nazari looked skeptical. "Are you certain this is wise? These men are experienced fighters, and they have already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Walking into their trap could result in your death and no benefit to the hostages." Sarah felt a familiar surge of confidence, the first she had experienced in months. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been trained for throughout her military career. The political complexities and international implications made it more delicate than typical combat operations, but at its core, this was about understanding her opponents and finding a way to achieve her objectives while minimizing casualties. "They asked for me specifically," Sarah replied. "That suggests they believe I can understand their perspective in ways that other American officials cannot. If I can establish trust and open real communication, we might be able to find a solution that achieves their core objectives without requiring them to harm the hostages. Captain Torres looked concerned. With respect, ma'am, you've been out of active duty for months. Are you sure you're ready for this level of operational responsibility? Sarah met his gaze directly. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. But sometimes the best preparation for a mission is understanding what you're fighting for. These hostages need someone who can think like their captors while never forgetting that our primary objective is getting them home safely. The communication setup was established in a secure room within the command post. Marcus Webb tested the radio equipment while Dr. Foster reviewed psychological strategies for establishing rapport with hostile negotiators. Sarah sat quietly, mentally preparing herself for what might be the most important conversation of her career. The initial radio contact was scheduled for 6 o'clock local time. Ramon's group had specified that they wanted to speak directly with the ghost, and that any attempt to substitute another negotiator would result in immediate execution of one hostage. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As the appointed time approached, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her before dangerous operations. Her teammates were nervous, checking and rechecking equipment, but Sarah found herself entering the focused mental state that had made her effective as a special operations soldier. At exactly 6 o'clock, Marcus Webb established radio contact with the embassy. There was a brief exchange in Arabic between the hostage takers, and then a clear, educated voice came through the speakers in English. "This is Khalil Ramon. I am told that the American ghost wishes to speak with me." Sarah took the microphone, aware that everything she said over the next few minutes would determine whether this crisis moved toward resolution or tragedy. "This is Sarah Mitchell. I understand you requested to speak with me specifically." There was a pause, and then Ramon's voice returned, carrying what sounded almost like satisfaction. "Yes, I know who you are, Ghost. Your reputation precedes you. You are the one who led the raid on the Kandahar compound 3 years ago. You are the one who extracted the captured pilots from the Hellman stronghold. You are the one who understands that warfare is about more than simply applying overwhelming force." Sarah felt a mix of pride and concern at hearing her military accomplishments recounted by someone who had clearly studied her career in detail. "You seem to know a lot about my service record. I know that you are a soldier who understands the complexities of this region," Ramon continued. "I know that you have shown respect for local customs and have worked to minimize civilian casualties in your operations. I know that you are someone who might understand why we have taken this action." Sarah glanced at her teammates, who were listening intently to every word. Dr. Foster was taking notes, trying to analyze Ramon's psychological state and motivations. Captain Torres looked tense, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm willing to listen to your perspective," Sarah said carefully. "But my primary concern is the safety of the American citizens you're holding. If you want to have a real conversation about your grievances, we need to establish some basic trust." Ramon was quiet for several seconds before responding. "Trust is earned, Ghost, just as respect is earned. You have earned both through your actions over the years. That is why I am willing to speak with you. But understand that we are not criminals or terrorists. We are soldiers fighting for our people's freedom from foreign interference." Sarah recognized the ideological framework Ramon was using to justify his actions. It was similar to rhetoric she had heard from other insurgent leaders, but there was something more personal in his tone, a genuine sense of grievance rather than purely political motivation. "If you're soldiers fighting for a cause, then you understand the importance of protecting non-combatants," Sarah replied. "The people you're holding are diplomats and civilian workers, not military targets. They are representatives of a government that has brought nothing but death and destruction to our region." Ramon shot back, his voice hardening. "How many of our civilians have died in American airstrikes? How many of our children have been killed by drones? Where was the protection for non-combatants then?" Sarah felt the weight of the conversation shifting. Ramon wasn't just making political demands. He was expressing personal grief and anger that had been building for years. This made him potentially more reasonable than a purely ideological terrorist, but also more unpredictable if he felt his grievances weren't being taken seriously. "I understand that you've lost people you cared about," Sarah said, putting genuine sympathy into her voice. "I've seen the costs of conflict from both sides. But Taking innocent people hostage isn't going to bring back the people you've lost or solve the underlying problems. Ramon's response came quickly, almost as if he had been waiting for this opening. Then, what would you suggest, Ghost? How does someone in my position seek justice for wrongs that have been committed against my people? Through official channels that ignore our complaints? Through diplomatic protests that are filed away and forgotten? Sometimes the only way to make the powerful listen is to take actions that they cannot ignore. Sarah realized that this conversation was moving beyond simple hostage negotiation into deeper questions about justice, accountability, and the moral complexities of modern warfare. Ramon was challenging her not just as a negotiator, but as someone who had participated in the very military actions he was protesting. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Ramon outlining his specific grievances and Sarah working to understand his motivations while keeping the focus on the safety of the hostages. By the end of the call, she had established a foundation for ongoing communication, but she also understood that resolving this crisis would require more than traditional negotiation tactics. As Sarah set down the microphone, she looked around at her teammates' concerned faces. They had all heard the same conversation, but she suspected they had reached different conclusions about what it meant. "He's more sophisticated than our intelligence suggested," Dr. Foster said. "This isn't just about political demands. He's seeking some kind of personal validation for his grievances." Captain Torres looked troubled. "He knows too much about your service record. That suggests intelligence-gathering capabilities that are concerning. We might be dealing with a more organized and well-connected group than we realized." Sarah nodded, processing the implications of what she had learned. Ramon had specifically requested her involvement because he believed she would understand his perspective in ways that other American officials could not. That gave her a unique opportunity to influence the situation, but it also meant that the success or failure of this mission would rest almost entirely on her ability to find common ground with someone who saw her as both an enemy and a potential ally. The real negotiation was just beginning. Over the next 48 hours, Sarah established a communication routine with Ramon that gradually built trust while maintaining focus on the hostages' welfare. Their conversations revealed a complex individual whose actions were driven by personal loss rather than abstract ideology. Ramon had lost his wife and daughter in an airstrike that had been intended to target a suspected terrorist safe house. The intelligence had been wrong, and an entire neighborhood of civilians had paid the price. Sarah found herself walking a delicate line between acknowledging the legitimate grievances Ramon expressed while never wavering from her primary mission of securing the hostages' release. Her military experience had taught her to compartmentalize emotions, but she couldn't ignore the genuine pain in Ramon's voice when he described finding his family's bodies in the rubble of their home. The breakthrough came during their fourth conversation when Ramon made an unexpected offer. "I want to meet with you face to face, Ghost. No weapons, no tricks. Just two soldiers talking about how to end this without more bloodshed." Sarah's teammates immediately objected to any possibility of her entering the embassy building. Captain Torres was particularly adamant that such a meeting would be tactical suicide, while Dr. Foster worried about the psychological risks of Sarah developing Stockholm Syndrome or being manipulated by an experienced extremist. But Sarah recognized an opportunity that might not come again. Ramon was offering to trust her with his life by meeting face to face, which suggested he genuinely believed she might be different from other American officials he had encountered. If she could establish that level of personal trust, she might be able to negotiate a peaceful resolution that would save both the hostages and Ramon's fighters. General Nazari was skeptical, but ultimately supportive when Sarah outlined her proposal. "If you believe this meeting could end the crisis, we will support your decision. But understand that if something goes wrong, we may not be able to help you." The meeting was arranged for the following morning in the embassy's main conference room. Sarah would enter the building alone and, unarmed, trusting Ramon to honor his promise of safe conduct. Her teammates would monitor the situation from the command post, but there was little they could do if things went badly. Sarah spent the night before the meeting reviewing everything she knew about Ramon and his organization, trying to anticipate how the conversation might develop. She also found herself reflecting on her own motivations and the strange journey that had brought her from a discharged military career to this crucial moment. 6 months ago, She had been convinced that her usefulness as a soldier had ended. Critics had questioned her judgment, colleagues had doubted her abilities, and she had begun to believe that maybe they were right. Now, 23 American lives depended on skills that only she possessed, and she was being asked to undertake a mission that would have challenged even the most experienced active duty personnel. The morning of the meeting, Sarah dressed in simple civilian clothes and walked the 2 blocks from the command post to the embassy compound. Local security forces had cleared a path through their perimeter, but Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching her approach the building. If this went wrong, she would become another casualty of a conflict that seemed to have no clear resolution. The embassy's front entrance had been barricaded by Rahman's fighters, but they had left a small side door accessible for Sarah's arrival. As she approached the building, she felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her most dangerous missions. This was what she had been trained for throughout her military career, walking into hostile territory with nothing but her wits and her ability to read people and situations. Rahman was waiting for her in the conference room, exactly as promised. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had spent years in combat. He was dressed in simple military fatigues without insignia, and Sarah noticed that he had indeed kept his promise about weapons. There was no gun visible, though she assumed his fighters were positioned nearby. "Thank you for coming, Ghost," Rahman said, gesturing for her to take a seat across the conference table from him. "I know this required considerable courage on your part." Sarah sat down and studied Rahman's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw was exhaustion, grief, and a kind of desperate hope that suggested he genuinely wanted to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis. "I'm here because I believe you want the same thing I do," Sarah said. "An end to this situation that doesn't require more people to die." Rahman nodded slowly. "You know, I have studied your military record extensively over the past year. Not because I planned this operation, but because I was trying to understand how someone could be both an effective soldier and still maintain their humanity in a place like this." Sarah felt a chill at the implication that Rahman had been researching her for months before the embassy seizure. "What did you conclude?" "That you understood something that many of your colleagues did not," Rahman replied. "That military force is a tool to be used precisely, not a hammer to be applied to every problem. That the best soldiers are those who know when not to fight." The conversation continued for over an hour, moving between Rahman's personal story, his political grievances, and his current situation with the hostages. Sarah gradually understood that he had not planned the embassy operation as a suicide mission. He genuinely believed there might be a way to achieve his objectives and survive to continue his struggle. The key insight came when Rahman revealed his true demands. The political rhetoric about prisoner releases and American withdrawal was largely for public consumption. What Rahman really wanted was acknowledgement from the American government that mistakes had been made, that innocent civilians had been killed, and that some form of accountability was possible. "I don't need revenge, Ghost," Rahman explained. "I need recognition that my family's lives mattered, that their deaths weren't just acceptable collateral damage in someone else's war." Sarah realized that this was something she might actually be able to deliver. The American government had mechanisms for acknowledging civilian casualties and providing compensation to families who had been wrongly affected by military operations. It wouldn't bring Rahman's family back, but it might provide the closure he needed to end the crisis peacefully. "If I could arrange for that kind of acknowledgement, would you be willing to release the hostages?" Sarah asked. Rahman was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering the implications of what she was suggesting. It would need to be public and official, not some quiet settlement that disappears from public attention. The world needs to see that America can admit its mistakes and try to make amends. Sarah knew this would be a difficult sell to her superiors in Washington. The American government was traditionally reluctant to acknowledge errors in military operations, especially in a context that might be seen as giving in to terrorist demands. But she also knew that 23 American lives were at stake, and that Rahman was offering a relatively reasonable path to resolution. "I would need to make some phone calls," Sarah said. "But I think this might be something we can work with." Rahman surprised her by smiling slightly. "You know, Ghost, when I heard that you had left the military, I thought perhaps America had lost one of the few soldiers who understood the complexities of fighting in this part of the world. But now I see that maybe you were exactly where you needed to be for this moment. The next several hours involved intense negotiations with Washington, with Sarah serving as the intermediary between Ramon's demands and what American officials were willing to offer. The breakthrough came when Director Crawford managed to arrange for a senior State Department official to issue a public statement acknowledging that errors had been made in targeting decisions and expressing genuine regret for civilian casualties. The statement wasn't everything Ramon had hoped for, but it was enough to provide him with a face-saving way to end the crisis. More importantly, it included a commitment to review targeting procedures and improve compensation processes for civilian casualties in future operations. The release of the hostages was arranged for the following morning. Ramon's fighters would surrender their weapons and submit to arrest by local authorities, but they would be processed through civilian courts rather than military tribunals. Ramon himself would likely face serious charges, but he had extracted a level of recognition for his grievances that he had never expected to achieve. As Sarah prepared to leave the embassy building, Ramon stopped her at the conference room door. "I want you to know, Ghost, that meeting you has restored some of my faith that there are Americans who can see beyond military superiority to understand the human costs of your country's actions abroad." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at his words. She had succeeded in her mission and saved 23 American lives, but she also understood that she had been dealing with someone whose anger and grief were entirely justified by his experiences. "I hope you find some peace, Khalil," she said, using his first name for the first time. Ramon nodded. "And I hope America finds more soldiers like you, who understand that true strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to seek understanding." The hostage release proceeded smoothly the next morning, with all 23 Americans emerging from the embassy building unharmed. Local media coverage focused on the successful resolution of the crisis, but international attention soon turned to the precedent set by the American government's public acknowledgement of targeting errors. Sarah's role in the negotiations remained largely classified, but word spread quickly through military and intelligence communities about the former soldier who had talked her way into a terrorist-controlled building and emerged with a peaceful resolution. The whispers were different now than they had been 6 months earlier. Instead of questioning her judgment or suggesting she was past her prime, people were talking about her courage, her tactical intelligence, and her ability to achieve objectives that conventional military force couldn't accomplish. The flight back to the United States gave Sarah time to process what had happened and what it meant for her future. The self-doubt that had plagued her since leaving the military had been replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. She had been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable and had proven that her skills and experience were not only relevant, but irreplaceable. Director Crawford was waiting for her when she arrived at Washington Dulles Airport. "I have a proposition for you, Sarah," he said as they walked through the terminal. "How would you feel about leading a new unit focused on crisis negotiation and unconventional conflict resolution? We've realized that there are situations where traditional military approaches aren't sufficient, and we need people who can bridge the gap between combat operations and diplomatic solutions." Sarah smiled, thinking about the young woman who had enlisted in the military with dreams of making a difference in the world. After months of wondering if that dream had died, she was being offered the chance to serve her country in an entirely new way. "I'm interested," she said, "but I have some conditions about how this unit would operate and what kind of authority it would have." As they discussed the possibilities, Sarah felt the last traces of doubt and uncertainty fade away. She was no longer the washed-up soldier that critics had dismissed. She was someone who had proven that experience, wisdom, and the courage to seek understanding could accomplish things that brute force never could. The call sign Ghost would soon carry new meaning in intelligence communities around the world, not as a reference to someone who could move unseen through hostile territory, but as someone who could find solutions in seemingly impossible situations, who could bridge divides that seemed unbridgeable, and who could remind everyone that the most powerful weapon in any soldier's arsenal is the wisdom to know when not to use a weapon at all. Sarah Mitchell had found her way back to purpose, and the world was about to discover that she was far from finished serving her country. In fact, Her most important missions still lay ahead.